And also, just so everybody knows, I am recording this session, so we will be able to present it to folks who either weren't able to join or would like to view again in future. And then last piece, want to acknowledge that as organizations that are focused on land stewardship, it's important for us to always be focusing on building relationship and restoring relationship with the indigenous peoples who have occupied this land for time immemorial. Specifically, the land that we are on, that I am on, I want to speak for everybody's geographic location, is home to various Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish, who are still federally unacknowledged. Speaking for AIA Seattle, we're determining the best ways to be working with them, including paying rent and finding better ways to partner with our indigenous communities that still live on this unceded land. With that, I will pass it off to everybody else who put together this fantastic event. First will be Mariana Misic and Whitney Lewis from AIA Seattle's Diversity Roundtable. If you have any tech questions, feel free to address them to me personally in the chat box. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mariana Misic, and can you guys hear me okay? Yes, okay. So I'm a co-chair of Diversity Roundtable, outgoing co-chair with AIA Seattle, and with Whitney Lewis, who is my co-chair. And Diversity Roundtable is a group that elevates, inspires, and empowers individuals of underrepresented backgrounds in the profession of architecture through scholarship, community service, and activism. We plan, host, and engage in many different types of program and initiatives throughout the calendar year. Some of our events are annual and have been reoccurring since the committee's inception in 1986. Others are newer initiatives and one-offs that we take part of, and typically at the beginning of each year, which starts in fall, we lay out the program for the upcoming year and look for opportunities that align with our committee's mission. And some examples of programs and initiatives that we work on are Architects in Schools, Diversity by Design, which is an exhibit that is coming up in collaboration with King Station Art and Hip Hop Architecture. We also co-host Social Hour series with Seattle International Architecture Forum, which is a bit of on hold now due to the health situation. Anyhow, so that's a little bit about the Diversity Roundtable. We meet every first Tuesday of the month. Currently, we meet virtually, and through AIA Seattle's website, you can find the link to our committee and the link to our meeting, or you can reach out to Whitney and myself or to Connor, and he can connect you with us. And without further ado, I will introduce Leon Holloway, the president of NOMA Northwest.
Yes, good morning. Can everybody hear me? Awesome. Well, good morning. Thanks for joining us for this lively discussion on a Saturday. I know we probably have a bunch of other things that we would like to do, but I think we're going to be in for a great discussion today. I'm Leon Holloway, the current president of NOMA Northwest. NOMA Northwest is an organization that advocates for greater cultural diversity and equity within the design industry. We provide a platform where minority AEC professionals and allies can work together to affect change within the workplace, as well as in schools and communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. NOMA Northwest empowers its members to thrive and grow through professional community-based initiatives and programs. And we welcome and support all marginalized individuals of every color, gender, sexual orientation, and religion throughout the Pacific Northwest. A few of our initiatives are basically the three tenets that we have, are workplace advocacy, where we do virtual town halls, panel discussions, BIPOC networking and support, student outreach, where we do the hip hop architecture camp, students support, especially higher ed education, resume and portfolio reviews, interview prep, meet and greet with local A&E firms and mentorship opportunities. We also do community outreach through Sawhorse Revolution and Building Workshop Partnership and through the Seattle Design Festival. If you want, we usually have monthly meetings where we all have town halls or virtual happy hours every month. But we have our board meetings every 2 weeks or so. But if you're interested to find out more, go to nomanorthwest.org, or I'll put in the chat our email address so you can reach out for us. So do I turn it over to Rico? No?
I'll introduce Rico. It's all good. Good morning,
Okay.
everybody. So I'm Whitney, co-chair with Mariana, and I will say that it's an honor to introduce Rico, and here it goes. So Rico Kingdongo is DLR group principal and has been working for 25 years to revitalize and reimagine some of Seattle's historic landmarks and neighborhoods. A civic design leader for the firm, Rico believes that through proactive design, vision, and multi-agency collaboration, opportunities for social change can be realized through community-invested civic projects. Rico is an active AIA volunteer, serving as AIA Seattle president from 2012 to 2013, and as a board member from 2009 to 2014. Rico was a mayoral appointee to the historic Seattle Council for 6 years, was a founding member of the National Organization of Minority Architects, Northwest Chapter, and is current chair for the Pike Place Market Preservation and Development Authority. Rico sat on the AIA 2030 National Steering Committee, a committee born out of AIA Seattle that has seen to it that 24 cities nationally are providing curriculum to help design teams and owners meet the 2030 challenge. Rico was identified in 2011 by AIA National as a citizen architect on the move, was awarded the AIA Seattle Young Architect Award in 2014, and was recently recognized again as citizen architect. Lastly, and certainly not least, Rico was recently appointed as the most recent Northwest and Pacific regional representative and representative to the Strategic Council. Without further ado, Rico Kingdongo.
Thank you, Whitney, and thank you all for taking out time on a beautiful weekend to have this important discussion. So hopefully we can have a lively discussion. Everybody that's on this panel, I am very honored to be with, and I feel like I have, well, I mean, Dal and I have had a relationship for many, many, many years, most of those 25 years that I've been in practice. Sam and I have built a relationship since he came on to his position with the city, which I'll talk about in a minute. In June, I have had the pleasure of getting to know recently, who I very much admire her work in Oakland and other locations, but we were just a part of a virtual narrative for AIA National for their first virtual conference this year. So you should check that out if you can. So we are here today, and I'm going to pull out some notes that I've got to talk about how planners, advocates, public officials, urbanists can advance the cause of racial justice, social justice. Given the breadth of inequities in our society, and certainly that has been exacerbated and made plain due to this COVID crisis and quarantining that we have all been having to manage, and then elevated even further during the George Floyd protests, and locally here in Seattle, the Chaz and the Chop. We know that our communities of color are disproportionately affected and have always been underserved, and that is no less true now. I think that for a design community, a lot of people are asking the question about what can we do to make a difference not only in this time, but in general. To read a statement that we had prepared, as urban planners, developers, designers, and we help to create cities, and what we know is that in many cases, those the institutions that exist and the built environment that we create does in fact perpetuate segregation, deprivation of opportunity for minority communities and BIPOC communities of color, and that we know the tangible effects of urban design and built environment on life expectancy, exposure to crime, access to education, economic stability. I've been talking a great deal lately about the social determinants of health and how our built environment considerations drive and impact all of those, and we can get into that in more detail as we talk today. But we also know that as a development community that we hold the specific knowledge and expertise and power to make change and make a difference and move the dial on issues of equity and equality and justice. And so this panel that we've assembled as part of NOMA and the DRT is to talk about all of those things. I am blessed to be with a group of Black leaders in the industry in built environment. And so I want to do introductions for each of the three of you, and then allow each of you 5 to 7 minutes to talk about the work that you do and your expertise and opinion on this important subject matter. And then we'll jump into a question and answer session, some questions that we prepared, and also open up for those of you that have been able to join us today to ask your questions as well. And I will just, I'll moderate that discussion. So first, I want to introduce Sam Assefa, Director of Seattle Office of Planning Community Development. Prior to his appointment in 2016, Sam served as the Senior Urban Designer for City of Boulder, Colorado. From 2002 to 2010, Sam was the Director of the Land Use and Planning Policy at Chicago Department of Planning and Development, and he served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Mayor Richard Daley. Between 1991 and 2002, Sam worked as the Senior Urban Designer for San Francisco architecture firm SMWM, as well as City of San Francisco Planning Department. Sam, like myself, has a little bit of a board addiction and has worked on numerous boards, including AA Regional Urban Design Committee, and is founding member of the Center for Art and Public Life at California College of the Arts, where he was an adjunct professor of architecture. Sam serves as a resource team for the Mayor's Institute on City Design, MICD, a team of distinguished professionals from across the country with expertise architecture, urban design, city planning, and related fields. He's a frequent speaker, both locally and nationally, and he's a graduate of MIT with a Master in City Planning and University of Illinois with a BA in Architecture. Our second panelist, June Grand, is a registered architect and current president of San Francisco chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects. June is founder and design principal of Blink Lab Architecture, a boutique research-based architecture and design practice she founded 20 years ago. Combined with her high energy and aptitude for innovation, June is heavily involved in front-end conceptualization for her projects. Her contributions have been consistently recognized for their rational yet provocative approach, always resolving complex issues and project goals. June is the 2019 YBCA 100 awardee on the list of 100 people using their creative and collective power to make change. Donald King, FAIA, with whom I was a former partner at our old firm, DKA Architecture. Donald was born in Port Huron, Michigan in 1949. Donald was the youngest of 6 children of Ernestine Knox King. Through his inspiring mother, Donald knew as a child that he wanted to be an architect and make a difference in the lives of those whose prosperity, for whom prosperity had left behind. His practice in Seattle serves African American, Latino, Latina American, Asian Pacific American groups, as well as the majority population on a variety of project types. Donald is facilitator of a collaborative design approach and believes in how it empowers both clients and community. As former president and CEO of DKA Architecture, Donald has over 40 years of experience in planning and design and has completed over 400 successful projects, many of which I had the pleasure of being a part of with Donald. And he's also been published in numerous books and periodicals. Donald was elevated to fellow in the year 2000. Can't believe it was that long ago now. And was awarded the AI Seattle Medal of Honor in 2015. And Donald, I think you also just rolled off of your position on the AIA National Board recently as well. With that, I want to move over into panel introductions and 5-minute presentations. And June, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Can I get share screen? Okay.
You can share a screen.
Okay. I timed myself. I have 5 minutes. So can you hear me fine?
Yes.
So in thinking about today's panel discussion and the title of our panel, one of the things that came to mind was I have been thinking about the role of the architect ever since probably graduation. And it's been a crystallizing process. I think I've finally come down to my view really reflects my innate personality, which is to be perpetually questioning. And so I see the role of the architect, particularly the Black architect, is one of inquiry. And I think that starts through observation, questioning, theorizing, having discussions, testing ideas, and kind of rinse, repeat. Because this idea around questioning or perpetual questioning really came to me when I started the practice, where we started the practice with the intention of being pure play, sustainable building technology designers, but wanted to bring that thought around sustainable design to building and in buildings specifically for underserved communities. While attempting to bring that design skill set to these communities, what I really learned was we needed to center advocacy as part of our process, because underserved communities lacked the professional voice to articulate their needs at the table. What I was seeing was an adversarial relationship between communities and, say, urban planning. And so we inserted our position as we must bring design, advocacy, and technology as questioning architects to communities. And so here today, I'm positing four views. One is I see our roles, not only Blake Lab, but Black architects, as being catalysts in the very informal relationships that exist within our communities. There is a tendency to think of communities as these hard wall, hard defined, hard solutions such as placekeeping, where you come in and paint pretty colors on the street and bring in colorful chairs and hang some string lights, and this is a solution for the community. But we know through talking to community members that in order for you to be successful, you need to understand the informal relationships that exist within communities in order to bring solutions to these communities. By inserting ourselves in this informal relationship, we can then allow the rejection of the narrative that is often portrayed of Black communities, which is a narrative that talks about containment, communities are in crisis, and they need a humanitarian savior approach to solve their problems. And I absolutely reject that. And I think every Black architect should reject that narrative, but they also need to come forth with an alternative position about how to present those ideas that the community wants solved and how to solve those problems for communities. So I see our role as both being a catalyst, but also rejectionists of really many theories. But in order for us to do that, we need to wrap our arms around the fact that our own Blackness allows us to have an environmental oneness with these underserved communities. And this environmental oneness stems purely from the fact that you are racially aligned. Your history is aligned, whether you are from a middle class or very poor community, there is a history, a genesis that aligns you with that environment. And I think that environmental oneness, I'm not calling it brotherhood, I'm not calling it Black love, I'm saying it's an innate ability to comprehend some of the issues in the community, but also an ability to understand where celebration lies, where a community says it wants to celebrate something, we have an ability to tap into that. And so by celebrating our universal oneness, we are then able to reject universal theories around what Black communities need. We are able to reject universal theories around placekeeping and start to tap into that local, latent, informal ways that these communities communicate and express their collective values and express those collective values spatially. I think it's important that we start to localize our thoughts and start to tap into those very nuanced, latent, informal cultural relationships that will allow us to create unique forms, unique solutions for those particular neighborhoods. And that will allow us to say, propose something that's different for East Oakland versus a solution for West Oakland. So that kind of gives you a basis for how we associate our role as architects of the civic dialogue, which is one which is advocacy is centered between design and technology. So I'm gonna leave it there.
A beautiful place to leave it, June. Thank you for your words of wisdom, and I look forward to diving into a little bit more detail once we get into our Q&A. Donald, you have the mic. Although here.
Can hear me clearly, hopefully.
Yep, there you go.
Good morning. Good morning, all. And June, thank you for that. That was very beautifully stated, almost poetic in talking a lot about what I have done in my career. Just a little bit of the additional background to some of what Rico had said in my resume is the ideas of how I got to where I am now. And from that young age of 12 and wanting to be an architect without knowing fully all of what that involved and all of the challenge and somewhat the barriers I encountered on my way to becoming an architect and to continue to practice. Some of that really made me stronger. It built my muscles to really identify what and how I should be an architect. What I should be doing. I began practice as fairly traditional in firms, but very early introduced to the community design center movement of the 1960s, late 1960s. I began working in groups in Detroit, Michigan on how citizens, how regular people, our community members could engage in the practice of self-empowerment, of controlling their destiny and the planning and design of their communities. This was quite revolutionary at the time. As a matter of fact, a lot of us doing this were considered more on the revolutionary end than on the professional practice end. But it was something that built my approach to architecture, to planning, and to community development. From that point on, I was kind of hooked on the idea of community-based practice, even though there was no real basis of education, of resource to do that. That has come along in the past 40 plus years that I've been doing that. In a community-based practice, we learned that our clients, our community, are not always as prepared, as June so eloquently stated, to take up the issues of empowering themselves to have control over their destiny, having control over the communities and of their communities and what has happened to them, and how to reduce the harm that has been done by poor planning policies, poor housing development policies, and others in the process that has been harmful and equitably unjust to urban communities. And urban communities have been primarily Black communities. Those that I have worked in have been. So how and what do I do to begin to change that? And a lot of what I do is working at the grassroots level and working with communities and working with those people that have needs and finding ways to meet those needs in a collaborative effort. Not in a I know best and I'm here to save you effort. Not in what I call a Bwana effort, where Bwana gets to shoot the gun, but you know, the native has to carry the gun. So gun's not a great metaphor for this, but you know, I often use that phrase Bwana from the old Tarzan and African films that we've seen about how the white man has always been superior to the Black man or the Black woman, and how that superiority has really driven how we see architecture, how we see planning, how we see community development. With those people that have empowered themselves to see beyond that, they can see an equity in what they're doing. They can see a place in what they're doing that they have elevated to an equal status. An equal status does not necessarily mean that you have the credentials, that you have the degrees, but an equal status may mean that you know best for what's needed in your community. And that's the people that I listen to. Many of our clients, as Rico very well know, are often short on fees, short on construction funds. We had to be very creative in finding ways to be able to help them with that. So that's a start right there. Short on resources is what our community has been. And being short on resources has not necessarily been their fault. I won't go into a lengthy discussion on the history of racial inequities, but the idea that we have to work with what we have and how do we do that creatively. Many of our clients, we've had to actually go out and seek grants or other funding for our fees before we could even get started, after we've done quite a bit of work that is considered pro bono. I consider it also just a natural way of practicing in community. We've also had to, from the time that I worked in the Watts Urban Workshop in Los Angeles, have an adversarial relationship with the government-based planning officials, because they felt that we were infringing upon their right to be the planners of the community. And in that radical role, we said, no, the community has that right. That was more than 40 years ago. I was in Watts. And now we see government agencies, thankful to people like Sam, that understand that community now has more of a voice in setting their agenda, in planning policies. And I look forward to them having even more of a voice in setting housing policies and housing choices. The work that we do is comprehensive and broad. It is interdisciplinary, it is multidisciplinary. to be able to resolve some of the issues and some of the problems that we have inherited from decades of racial inequity is going to take all oars in the water, all people involved, and all possible solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald, as always. Sam, you get the last introduction.
Wow, Rico, thanks for having me follow June and Donald. I don't know how I'm going to follow that, but first of all, thank you for AI Seattle and NOM for inviting me and Rico. This is a very important conversation. My own sort of journey that got me here took meandering road. Just like Donald, I became passionate about architecture at a very early stage, age 10, 11, but it was born out of my passion for drawing since I was a kid. And this was in Ethiopia, and my fascination with this incredible ancient plutonic form architecture of religious buildings in Ethiopia that are carved out of single rock were my fascination and my passage towards a passion for architecture. So I used to love to draw those. And in doing that, I was also sort of looking at the impact of form and shape and place in that sort of cultural setting, in this case, the religious setting. Not that I was, and my family were, part of the Ethiopian Coptic church, but I was never into the religion, but I was into sort of the fascination about the form and how people interact with that form. And I always wanted to be an architect when I grew up. Fast forward, lived as a refugee in Kenya, and I still had the passion to study architecture. And I think to Donald's point, sort of the history is shaped by, the dominant culture. So everything that I read about architecture at that time was, places like Chicago and the Chicago School or in economics, but also the architecture. So my passion was to go to Chicago and study architecture. And I ended up doing that finally. And after graduating and starting the practice, within about 4 or 5 years, I just saw that I had a jaded view of it in part, and I won't go into detail, but just looking at how the profession is practiced and who we served and as designers, and it was fantastic. You design, things get built, but I just took a different route at that point, and I thought this is not exactly what I thought it would be. And that's when I decided to go to graduate school to study city planning. And in the graduate school, got introduced to the anti-apartheid movement, and I was heavily involved in that while studying city planning, and the issues of equity and affordable housing in my own thesis came out of that engagement. And where I cut my teeth in city planning was actually 2 years of pro bono work while working for a firm in San Francisco in the Hunters Point shipyard area. Shipyard is about 500 acres that was closed in 1975. It used to be a Navy shipyard. And the reason why most of the African Americans who came to San Francisco came there was to work in the shipyard prior to, in the 50s and 60s. And about 19,000 African Americans used to be employed there. So the Bayview Hunters Point area had, I think to this day, probably the highest home ownership of the African American community there. But when I was there in the early 90s, the unemployment rate was about close to 15 to 20% for the African Americans. So the parents who had wealth owning homes, but the kids were not working at all. So we worked on pro bono work to engage the Hunters Point shipyard community and organizations by putting together sort of engagement process that are playing games, like planning games, so that they really understand what power they have if they were well informed about what to ask the redevelopment agency or the planning department in terms of what their vision is for that shipyard, which was not part of the base closure program at that time until 2 years of pro bono work working with the community groups to come up with ideas and proposals that then convinced Nancy Pelosi was the representative for that area, and she worked to get the base closure as part of the BRAC program, which is allocated federal funding for cleanup. And there's a lot of toxic conditions with the site. And that then generated and started the planning process. So that for me was foundational from two perspectives. One, what Donald talked about, which is, I thought when I went to architecture school in 5 years, I thought I knew everything about urban planning. I know better than anyone else. Community planning, design, I know better than they do because I studied it in this really credible school. That taught me that I actually know very little. And it comes to, I think what June was talking about sort of the local issues that you have to, that they know much, much better than you yourself do. And one of the lessons there was, it is amazing when people have the tools to give them informed data or statistics that we talk about, in our sort of Ivy League schools or Ivy Towers, but put it in human terms and human language that is relevant to them and give them the tools. They come up with incredible ideas that you have not thought about in terms of design, land use, or any sort of proposed ideas around the transformation of the place that is relevant to them. So that was really foundational for me moving forward in all of the different, lived and worked about 6 cities, 4 countries, 3 continents. So what is common in all of them are people in any place you go, they all want the same thing. The difference are there are specific issues, their own culture, their own needs that they know better than you do. So bringing me to now Seattle, I joined here 4.5 years ago, a new office that was started in 2015, Office of Planning and Community Development, for the specific mission, at least when it was created, to help coordinate the unprecedented growth that Seattle is experiencing from both infrastructure, housing, planning, and long-range planning and current planning perspective. But also the second part of that mission was, how do we address issues of equity when not everyone was benefiting from the growth that this Seattle, which was an enviable growth, it was experiencing. So those are kind of the charge. And one of the things that I'm proud of starting within that structure, you don't learn that in architecture school, is an equitable development program, which was purely initiated by community groups and organizations. I just happened to be at the right place to actually give it a structure and institutionalize that community-initiated ideas around projects that they feel are the most important in terms of anti-displacement, ideas that they come up with around what kind of capacity did they want to have to be able to have their own wealth or their own community center or their own housing. So that program has been a pilot in my department that has been growing in the last 4 years to the point where we have 25 community-based organizations coming from pretty much all BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities that are that we're working with and funding. And the money is not the most important thing in that. It's really community building and connecting the dots and the culture of that connection through this program. Not only 25 organizations, we're working actually close to 50 community-based organizations that my staff and my team engage with, organizations that apply for grants and they were not successful, but we continue to have that connection and engagement. So Office of Planning, so generally long-range planning, land use planning and zoning, urban design, equitable development program. It also includes community planning. The design commission and the planning commissions are housed in this, within this department. So it's been about 4.5 years. So in everything that I do within the department, I think that foundational lessons from San Francisco plays a role that community knows best in terms of decisions. So that's kind of sort of my path to where I am now. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sam. I often, in talking about community engagement, something that you said really resonated with me. I talk about the fact that as practitioners in the built environment education that we received, that we do have a set of tools and a set of expertise, but that education regarding what our clients need and what our communities that we are serving need, that education, like we are coming to them with tools. They are experts in what they do and what they need and what they want in their dreams, and we have to come open to be educated and to help them lead. And so I think that part about knowing what our lane is and then how we can help empower others is critical for actually making for real success. The only other thing I would say is like that it may not be about the money, but the money does actually help in terms of investing in community. So we have a bunch of questions. I will throw out there what we had originally intended was to have a moderated session where I go through the questions we prepared, and then have a Q&A session for folks to put questions into the chat, and I can give people the mic to answer questions, or I'll read the questions as they appear. I will throw out there though, just mixing it up a little bit. If you have a question for a panelist or a follow-on to something that we're in discussion about, don't hesitate to put it in the chat, and if I can work it in as we go, I will do that as well. The first question that we had is fairly open-ended. So to all three of our panelists, briefly, what does the typical American city look like to you? And is there an ideal urban landscape? And I would put that to any of the three of you. Sam, since this is something that drives your everyday, maybe you might want to start.
When I think of the ideal, not the ideal, but the sort of what an American city looks like, always my image is around a relentless Euclidean grid pattern in which high density development at the core, surrounded by sparse developments of industrial land, retail, street malls, surface parking, radiating out all the way to the horizon, a significant amount of then single family pattern of development. And then within that urban form, again, my sort of image of typical city, American city, is a segregated societal pattern of settlements, mostly the Black, Indigenous, people of color on one side of the tracks, white people on the other side of the tracks. And the story is, we all know, the one side of the tracks, lack of access to opportunity, has health disparities, income disparities, the exact opposite on the other side, and then a pattern of significant amount of them living in single family. You happen to be white, and you also have most of the amenities and resources distributed in those areas. So that's kind of my image. The ideal is, I think I'll go back to what June was talking about. The ideal is whatever is really responsive to the local culture, the local needs. When I was in graduate school, some of the conversation there was completely different, which was that there is an ideal pattern of city form that is really defined by the Judeo-Christian kind of Western thinking of patterns. They may not apply, everywhere. Chicago had the first modern times city plan, the 1909 Burnham's plan. It was based on the French Beaux-Arts plan. and it's beautiful, it's spectacular. How much does really think and talk about the local deviation to address? Well, it doesn't. And so what does that mean when we move forward? For me is how do you integrate the local nuances of chaos or whatever is appropriate for that specific culture? James Rojas, the person that I went to graduate school with, some of you know his work. He's done relentless work over decades around understanding what the Latino culture's ideal public space is. So typically the front yard, the street, the sidewalk is where the cultural activity happens in a Latino culture. In white culture, it's the backyard, the secluded or the protected area. Well, the same design is not going to serve both of them. So you have to think about what that means around the front yard and the stoops and where a lot of the social life takes place. So he talks a lot about that in terms of the importance of that. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sam. Donald or June, do you have anything that you would add to that before we move on to the next question?
I do. And I'm going to approach it from the discussion about migration. Being an immigrant myself, and I think at least 2 out of the 4 of us are immigrants, there is a sensitivity that comes from being a migrant. And I'm not talking about forced migration in the sense of gentrification. But when I think of the American city, I used to think of geometry, streets, yards, the stuff that we were taught in school. But lately, and actually no, since I've been here, I have been, even before I immigrated to the US, I've been aware of the scarification of the cities. So if you think back to the 70s and the bombed out Bronx, not the burnt buildings, et cetera, the scars of history. So when I think of the American city, that is what I actually see when I walk through it, is scars, where decisions were made that resulted in literally buildings being sacrificed, spaces being sacrificed. I think less about the residential spaces and more about where those obvious economic decisions were made to disinvest or to, well, some of it was to reap fire insurance. Some of these buildings were set on fire deliberately to reap the economic value from insurance policies. When I look at American cities, that's what I actually look for, and not intentionally, but I am very sensitive to the fact that there are deliberate decisions that result in massive scarring. And then now what I'm paying attention to a lot, I'm realizing I'm tapping into being sensitive as a migrant, is that this scarification and migration plays a specific role in how we understand each and every city, that there are differences in the migration patterns and the registration of those patterns result in specific scars. So for example, in West Oakland, we used to have a thriving blues district. It was called Harlem of the West. Now, when you go through West Oakland, what you see is the BART rapid transit line that resulted in the ripping out of cultural images and replaced with nothing but transit gray concrete. And for me, that's a scar. It's a scar, both a result of an economic decision that resulted in an urban planning decision, which resulted in the scarring of a neighborhood, which is then now wide open for new economic decision, new structures to come in, and this perpetual economic decisions has resulted in the African-American population being pushed out through a new economic forced migration. And you're seeing this cycle play out over and over and over. And so what I look at is actually, where are the scars? Because that tells me a lot about the migration patterns in a city and the economic and urban policies that were put in place that resulted in this scar. Now, in terms of an ideal city, my ideal city is where the voice, that space of communication, is one that's planned for and encouraged. To some extent, Jean Gell mentions that in his proposal for urban spaces, but I find that too Eurocentric. But I understand what he's trying to say, which is there's an informal space for us to communicate, to exchange, to relax, to be welcomed. That is my idealized version of what I would like to see in the American city, which is disappearing because our spaces are becoming more policed as they become more privatized. There is little space left for casual bumping up and exchanging ideas. We have very little space left for us to just meet ad hoc, to discover new things. Our spaces are becoming over-programmed. And so as a result, there is little room left to just play. And so for me, that is the idealized state that I would love to see a lot more conversation around, is how do we clean up the programming and remove programming so we can allow some of these casual encounters to return.
Thank you, June. Donald, do you have any closing thoughts? Just on this particular question.
I'll try to be quick with that. You know, I like to put it in context of Seattle. And Seattle is kind of a microcosm for percentage of African Americans to the majority population, is somewhat similar to the percentage of African Americans in the whole country to the majority population. It's kind of where the comparison ends, but it is worthy to note that even though we have a small African American population, somewhere between 12 and 14% in the city, it's the same as Los Angeles. We just have fewer people. But several years ago, late 1980s and early 1990s, I was on the Seattle Planning Commission at a fortuitous time because we were working on the first comprehensive plan for the city done in a couple of decades, where we were guilty, and I was one of those, in that is not looking at the history of the city, the history of redlining, the history of urban renewal, the history of transportation projects, freeways that did harm. We didn't look at the harm that had been done to certain communities, and particularly my community of the Central District, which was at one time the largest Black enclave north of the California Bay Area. We didn't look at what the impact of the comprehensive plan was going to have on that community in the context of its history, in the context of the inequities and inequality and harm that had been done through policies. So we didn't prepare the community, we didn't empower the community, and we did not take a look at how the impacts of the new comprehensive plan, which included densifying urban areas, was going to look. And what we find ourselves now is in a catch-up position of trying to repair some of the damage that was done by that unthinking, not thinking, not problem-seeking of what the comprehensive plan was going to do in a negative sense. We all sort of had the idea that we wanted improvement in our communities. Now there are communities that are afraid to improve themselves because they're afraid of gentrification and displacement. That is very sad. That's a sad turn of events, that an urban landscape now has become less integrated, less diverse in many of our urban cities. And the migration that I'd like to refer to as the Great Migration that brought my family and other families north and west from rural South as refugees from the repression of that area of the country. And now we find ourselves as being pushed out of an urban environment which we'd become very accustomed to. So what does the landscape look like? What should it look like? What it's looking like in Seattle now is more upper class, more white, less diverse, less people of color, and less choices in housing, less income for those that, there's declining income, for example, for African Americans in King County, when just about every other group income is rising. It is a combination of those things, as I said earlier, that really require a comprehensive set of solutions. But we are in catch-up mode now. We're in catch-up mode primarily from actions that we took to put us here.
Thank you, Donald. It's interesting. I had the good fortune of being able to be a part of the support committee for a young urban planner of color, Ishmael Nunez, who actually worked as a public space planner or public space management staff for Seattle Department of Transportation, but he wrote his thesis on the Black spatial imaginary in urban design practice, creating Black affirming public spaces, and from some comments, June, that you had made, and Donald, what you were just talking about, what he posited, that I believe creating public space that served a African American community specifically also served the community in general better. I think about that as we talk about what are the things that we've done in planning that have not served our communities of color, and how we might start to do it differently. It was a great thesis, and something that I'm hoping that that's something he's actually taking into his practice, but something for us to talk about. Sam, in Donald's comments about the comprehensive plan, I wonder if you have any thoughts there. That one of the questions that we were going to follow on with, so it's a great lead in, what are some of the things that the city is doing to address inequities in the way that we approach construction, development, built environment, and how can we, in the design community, begin to remove those inequities? I think if you can speak to that, and maybe the comprehensive plan specifically, which I know that there's an update that is to happen in 2024, I believe. That would be great for our audience.
Rico, did you want me to continue with my comments on the comprehensive plan to start?
Well, why don't we let Sam set the stage, and then Donna, you can add back in.
Great.
Sure. Just quickly, in what the city is doing around inequities and construction, the city doesn't do much more than what it can control, which is, a lot of our infrastructure departments are the ones who are engaged directly in construction or commissioning construction. So they have specific goals around mostly hiring consultants and procurement. Each of them have anywhere from 20 to 30, 39% goal in each of their infrastructure, whether it's transportation, public utilities, city lights. And generally, they do pretty well in terms of achieving that. But that's not wealth creation. And it's wonderful. It's great. In development, again, the city doesn't engage in development other than supporting either affordable housing programs or policies that really advance equities in development. I'll just give a brief example of what development means from the Equitable Development Initiative program that I mentioned. That was actually born out of the comprehensive plan when community groups sort of came up with that idea in 2015. In the 2016 update to the comprehensive plan, we embedded that policy at the 10,000-foot level in the comprehensive plan, including developing, maps that really, as a database to a lot of the things that we're talking about, which areas are most impacted by displacement, which areas have less access to opportunity. And once we have that data, then the EDI program focused on those areas. If you come from those geographic areas and you have a development idea, then you qualify for these grants. And we started out with $16 million. Now we have permanent annual Airbnb tax that feeds into that, $5 million. The mayor last year put $15 million additional into that. All of it focused on supporting community organizations that are coming out of those areas. Things like Rainier Beach Food Innovation Center, or Black and Tan Hall, or Duwamish Longhouse, African Women Business Alliance, the Ethiopian Community Center, the Filipino Community Center. All of those are types of projects that came with their own ideas that the EDI program funds, and then we combine that with Office of Housing and other city resources from a development perspective. And then there are policy issues. I think what you're alluding to around the comprehensive plan as well. And so the cities leverage our zoning and planning and policies. The comprehensive plan, as Donald mentioned, it came about as a state management act in the early 1990s. So it required all municipalities in the state of Washington to have a comprehensive plan that gets updated every 5 to 7 years. The objective of the comprehensive plan is to look for the next 20 years and address the significant key issues that are anticipated for the next 20 years, and then put the policies in the comprehensive plan, and then have an implementation plan. So in the 2016 update, we put, the focus was on affordable housing, affordability as we grow, and equity were key elements. On the equity, the Equitable Development Initiative was sort of identified. Then we put it down to the ground by creating an Equitable Development Implementation Plan and a financial support strategy that then brings it down to the ground. And then what I explained, a staff of 6 were hired to actually administer this program and expand that through that process. That's kind of how the comprehensive plan works. The current update is scheduled to be completed 2024. We have to start it in 2021. It takes 3 years to do that. We have to listen and engage communities in terms of what aspect of the comprehensive plan should be updated. But to Donald's point, in terms of the comprehensive plan of Seattle was actually lauded as one of the models when it was in place, because the focus was that we need to target our developments where we have the infrastructure, or where we expect future infrastructure of transportation, light rail, are anticipated. That is based on the notion that higher density, more concentration is good for the climate. It's per capita waste is less, per capita use of resources is less if you have density. And again, to June's point, Oakland's, transit centers, all of those were and have been built and continue to be built around transit-oriented development from that notion, without putting the guardrails of what the unintended consequences of those could be, meaning that you're not empowering the people who actually, before you displace the people who are there, you need to put a program that they can benefit from. So the comprehensive plan, where a starting point for our update now, and we've actually started, is looking at the racial impact of the last 20 years of the comprehensive plan. So for example, 80% of the city's growth over the last 20 years, 25 years, is targeted only 20% of the land. That's where the concentration, what are called urban villages and urban centers. And that's what the comprehensive plan targets. That, again, from a sustainability perspective, that is fantastic. The question becomes, when places like the Central District that were 70% African-American, in the 70s down to 13% now, they're very close to transit centers. They're very easy to get to downtown. We didn't put the guardrails previously when those policies were put in place. So the issues of displacement shouldn't be surprising when those places become attractive investment areas. Again, with all the flaws, things like the mandatory affordable housing program, which was actually part in the comprehensive plan, to address affordability, because the city has never had a requirement for affordable housing at all. And they've tried for almost 25 years. As flawed as it was, that was kind of one of the areas that address affordable housing as the city grows. That was put in place, and that needs to be tweaked, obviously, again and again. But we also have to look at the racial impact of those urban village strategies and look at what needs to be tweaked for the next update from that lens, specifically around how it has impacted BIPOC communities, or has it? And we want to have the data, and the sort of the baseline starting point is going to be, again, racial analysis of the comprehensive plan historically. And to Donald's point, then we need to figure out what then needs to be tweaked for the next 20 years. That is going to inform the next update. So that's kind of the context for the comprehensive plan. So we'll be we've started some of the work already, hired Policy Link, who helped us actually develop the Equitable Development Initiative in the comp plan at the last update. Now we're working with them to help us sort of look at the data and come up with recommendations in terms of what needs to be tweaked on the comprehensive plan at the next update.
And Sam, do you see that there will be a comprehensive community engagement for a BIPOC community and architects of color and planners of color to help inform that process?
So the funding part of that, significant amount of the resources are dedicated in the first year to 2 years. Any comprehensive plan update is the engagement process. So we don't come up and say, hey, these are the 3 policies that need to be addressed in the comp plan. That is informed by an extensive engagement of first year to 2 years of process of going out to, translate it into 15 or 18 different languages. We go out to meet communities where they are, at their churches, at their restaurants, at their gathering. So that the scope of the work engages significant amount of that as part of it. Architects, it's too early for architects. Obviously, they engage. Again, we're dealing with a high level policy issues at this stage, not in a very specific project. But yes, all the design community, as well as lay people and neighborhood organizations especially, are the ones that have to have their voices heard. As part of the racial analysis, actually, the big focus is going to be on BIPOC community engagement, very specifically around understanding from them what has impacted them because of urban village policies, or so that we can hear from them and then inform policy changes as part of that.
Thank you, Sam. Donald, I want to make sure we can get through the list of our questions, but did you have a closing thought on the comprehensive plan before we move to the next question?
Yeah, a couple of things, and Sam said most of what I had wanted to hear as far as the planning process, the comprehensive plan, which I've been out of the comprehensive plan business now for a few decades, is looking backwards also, looking at history, finding out what things were done that were harmful, and acknowledging that, number one, and finding ways to repair it and not do more harm going forward. And part of that not doing harm going forward is what you last talked about, Sam, and that's engagement in the community. And where I believe we as architects and planners can be most helpful is to be that resource, be that assistance in knowledge sharing in our community, to be able to thoughtfully examine, review, and comment on what the new comprehensive plan amendments are going to be, and to make sure that what we include are those anti-displacement strategies that we so desperately need to repair what we've done previously.
Rico, can I just add a small comment?
Of course.
Sam mentioned that in the comprehensive plan, it was too early for architects. And I'd like to push back against that statement, just slightly. No, not just from my own profession, but I'm going to give the example of the Oakland downtown plan, which started by hiring a firm that was not from Oakland. Actually, they were from Florida. The planning process started, and there was universal uproar from the entire BIPOC community across the city of Oakland against the planning process as it was being rolled out. And one of the things that, and this is all new to me because I am not a planner, I'm a pure play form maker. But I got to understand what was missing from the dialogue was the planners were looking purely from the horizontal perspective with very little looking back, a lot of dialogue about looking forward and planning for the future. But the reason why the community came up in uproar and stalled the planning I think we're 2 years behind, stalled was because there was no looking back and acknowledging some of the fruits and the assets that were there that were culturally relevant. But also the role I saw architects could have played was as assessing or explaining the value of the existing building assets and how to mark those for the future. And that was missing, and I believe still missing from our planning process, which is an integration of existing building qualities and mark which ones are relevant for keeping, not just historically, but their basic asset value. How easy are they to be converted from commercial to residential? How easy is it to convert from commercial to arts organization? This is part of planning, in my opinion, or should be, but was not part of the discussion. And it was stunning to me. And I think that's a role that architects could play as a sub-consulting role to the overall planning process that I admit I am new to this discussion about urban planning, but it was stunning to me that building assets and their evaluation was not part of a city evaluation process. When we have the database, we actually have the software technology to include that in the planning process, which we did not have prior. I accept that prior we did not have the technology, the software to do planning at this sophisticated level, but now we do.
I just want to add to Junior, absolutely.
Yeah, of course, Sam.
Yeah.
Please.
So one of the focus, and to that point around not only sort of important buildings, but how you communicate these complex planning issues in flat 2D. So one of the investments that I've made in my office over the last 2 years in preparation for this is to actually upgrade our GIS system in 3D modeling of the existing city completely. And then as we do, part of the work would be buildable lands analysis, in which we talk about in 3D form so that it is interactive with lay people, so that actually see that. And then to your point about important buildings, I think if you look at Jaime Lerner from Curitiba, it was one of the most important things that he did when he first became mayor of Curitiba. Was he was right in the midst of the comprehensive plan update. And one of the issues there was historic preservation. So he threw everything out the door. He said, you know, typically historic preservation is done by elite architects and cultural elites who know what important buildings are and what should be preserved. He said, no, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna have a survey. If you as a resident in your neighborhood think there's a mound that was historic for you because you love that mound as you go, kids go to school and or any structure, regardless of who the architect is. If you think that is important, I want you to vote on what should be historically preserved. So he did a citywide survey and everybody put what they think are the most important things from their perspective. So the most vote getters or identified structures or places, architects would not have made those buildings or structures historic if it wasn't done through that process. And then he jokes about, he said, well, there are a couple of really important buildings, and because I was the mayor, I sort of inserted those, but 90% of them were historically preserved because communities said that building is important to me, not just because of the architecture and the design or who planned it, because of the emotional and cultural attachment that they've had for generations. So I just want to put that out because of your question.
Thank you, Sam. I think because you have three architects in this conversation, you will get some bias from us about a role that we think that we all can play and should play in the planning process. My thesis in graduate school, my chair was a urban planner. Also, and I think that you know, June's discussion about, you know, the moving from an overarching scale to the granular individual sites and how that informs the fabric of community will be an important discussion as we look at this next update, and I'm excited for that process to begin anew, as it sounds like it is now. This question has a long lead into it. We know that living in neighborhoods without access to parks, sidewalks, etc., have an impact and effect on health and life expectancy, and inherently speak to lack of investment in community. There are federal programs such as HUD Community Development Block Grant Program, which I don't actually know is currently funded, which provide annual grants to cities and counties to carry out community improvement activities to benefit low-income, moderate-income residents. Part of that, and I think the Equitable Development Initiative is doing some of this in a way, can provide pathways to acquire property, fund rehabilitation of both residential and non-residential structures, do capital improvements for public facilities. The question, and June, you may have a lead in for this, what is the private sector's role in neighborhood development and improvement of neighborhoods? How are we funding those improvements? How do we do better? And how do we do it in ways that aren't displacing, particularly in BIPOC communities, families that are already there and who need to benefit from improvements that are invested in those communities?
You know, when I thinking about this question, and because I work so deeply with some of the most underserved communities, and I'm just leave Oakland for an example. If we look at West Oakland, it is stunning to me how many large parks are in West Oakland, and that's one of our most historic, older parts of the city. As you head east, the number of parks not only decrease in number, but they get smaller. And what I discovered over the last 5 years was the city had been spending almost 50% of our budget on one park, which is our Rose Park. Now, Rose Park is in North Oakland, not West, not East, North Oakland. And it has a real vibrant Friends of the Park community. And every year there's a fight, or every 2 years when we do the budget, there's a very public fight about why are we spending so much on this really isolated park while not investing in the neighborhood parks. And I find this conversation to be quite interesting, not only from the fact that our largest parks actually were West Oakland, not North Oakland, but yet our funding goes towards North Oakland. And also when you overlay that with the history or thought that government is supposed to govern for us all. Only when you look on the landscape, you realize that's actually not true. And the result is, when you overlay one more time with Prop 13 in California, which reduced our parcel taxes, property taxes. So the city's coffers are getting lower and lower while in relation to our population keeps increasing, but our budget and the amount that we have for recreation and parks keep declining. Now we only have one arborist for the entire city, one. So the role of private sector becomes critical. And now we have to look at the time and compare it, say the time of the Carnegies, where you're a historic family, you have wealth, you typically use that wealth by the time you're retirement age. You want to mark your legacy on the land. You build libraries, you invest in parks. Come forward to 2020, and our current, let's just call them young moneyed, are not as civically engaged, are not as embracing of the wider cultural and civic role that their wealth could be applied for. But I think it's essential that we start to remind and educate, because we have so many more billionaires in the Bay Area, but they're not as aware of the role that they could play in improving their environment. And I think it's essential that we start to cultivate their civic engagement in this process, because it's going to take a much longer process to try and fix the tax issue. So we have to try and get to the heart of the human being. And this is the role that I'm seeing private sector starting to play. Salesforce just this week has unleashed billions of funds towards education. And I saw that they released another 20 million yesterday to go towards our schools. I think examples, the Benioffs of the world coming forward and showing the role that they are willing to play in investing in our civic environment is going to become even more critical. So it's kind of like we've gone full circle back to the Carnegie example, which is you're so wealthy, it is time for you to physically invest in the city that you live in, that you employ a large part of the population, that you realize their tax breaks are actually not beneficial to the city and that you have to push it back. The downside I'm seeing is the contracting process for our cities is so exclusionary and so ridiculously laborious that our cities are having to acquire this private funding through grants. Now, the problem with grants is they're not transparent in how and that fund is disseminated. Who gets to use those funds? Who is hired to design for that community? That contracting process is extremely opaque. And so we have a philanthropic private sector wealth distribution system that is not publicly transparent. And so minority firms are not benefiting from this gazillion-dollar industry, which could be applied to our very communities. So it's kind of like you have to understand the history of wealth, the history of how wealth has played a role in our cities. And then what we're seeing today is our young wealthy are just not investing in the very cities that they live in. And we have to convince them to pivot and start to invest with our local talent. Your audio is off.
Thank you. Thank you, June. I related to the process by which government agencies procure permits. I think that one of the roles that we have to play as Black architects specifically is to involve ourselves with those entities and be on, I mean, we want the jobs, I want the jobs, but then also to be on the selection panels that that award those projects to ensure that more of us are represented in the decision-making process, but then also getting the work. I want to note the time is 11:30. We're only supposed to go until noon. There's a couple questions in the chat that I'm going to try to weave in. I do want to jump, June, because you mentioned this issue around taxation. I want to jump to a property tax discussion that we started when we were doing the prep for this session. Donald, you raised an issue regarding property tax and linking to reduction, reparations, negative impact of redlining, and what can be done about this. I'm putting you on the spot and I apologize for that, but can you bring us back to that discussion?
Mhm. Sure, and that was a discussion that we didn't have with all the participants that are on the call now, but it was a discussion that I have that is somewhat dissimilar to what June had talked about. It may be similar in the sense that what I'm proposing is fewer property taxes, particularly fewer property taxes for those that have been impacted by the historic injustices of redlining, of segregation, of urban removal from communities, and the idea that now that we have a more attractive Black community, that it has also become a more wealthy white community. Those of us that are left are living amongst millionaires. These are people that purchase $1 million homes. They're not the people that had the homes from decades ago that paid definitely under $100,000, if not much less, for those homes. But we're taxed as if we're millionaires because our property is valued at that now. It is driving more and more of us out for reasons that the public agencies, the government can fix, and they are obligated to fix this. This is not a do-good thing. This is an obligation. This is a reparation. This is a repair for the kinds of damage that was done to those people that lived under redlining, that lived under communities that were under attack from both private and public agencies. If we had a reduction or an elimination of property taxes for some of the people that have been harmed, and that case can be presented, then there would be actually more money in the income of those families, of those seniors, of those older adults, to make the repairs to their homes, to keep their homes, to probably invest in accessory dwelling units, that they would maybe able to stay on their property longer and stay within their community longer and continue to contribute to their institutions and churches longer. This is about the ideas of how do you close the white-Black wealth gap as well. If we are continued to be in a place to more of our income going out for reasons that are out of our control or seemingly out of our control, that are unjust, we need to take a hard look at how we can repair those. And property tax justice is one way to do that.
I don't disagree. If I know that a state tax is a third rail issue, political issue, I think that this one that you suggest will also be a third rail, a third rail political issue. But it certainly, I mean, as we talk about what do reparations look like, it certainly is compelling as a thought. June, I know that you started down a road around taxation and impact in Oakland. Do you have any other thoughts there?
I see Sam eager to get in there, so I'm just making sure.
I'm sorry, Sam.
I actually think you're talking about reparations or proportional tax, and a reduction for those who have suffered the most or whose incomes have not increased. In fact, they have gone down. So we need to start to balance that out. I actually have some faith in that we're able to peel away at that. And what gives me hope, who'd have thought we would talk about defunding and actually see defunding of police departments? So just based on that radical thought actually being embraced by not just one city, but several cities within the last, 2 months?
Yeah.
I think we have some possibility of progressive tax or some kind of reduction in taxes that might be able to be passed. It actually might be a way of calming the spirits.
Yeah.
Sam?
That was one of the points I was going to make. I think this is the time, Donald, and community groups, especially in the Central District, to actually rally around sort of politically, both state and the county. I think it's time to really address that issue. We have been, as a city, with our legislation agenda, have been advocating for that since MHA started, Mandatory Housing Affordability Program, for the last 3-4 years. And this current mayor has been very adamant, actually trying to get both the state and the county to address this issue. And in fact, the county responded incrementally. This year, they are going to be increasing the eligible income to 65% of the county's median. So, for example, if household income limit used to be 40,000, now it's going to be to 60,000 in terms of the property tax. I think there's incremental movement, but I think this is a time to really think about advocacy for that, because as you said, I think wealth is the most critical issue of equity that we face. You hear, if you know Richard Rothstein, he talks about, Blacks make 60% of whites today in terms of income, but they only have 10% of the wealth. If you think if they make 60% of white income, you would assume logically they should own property, wealth of 60%, but no. The difference is ownership. You can have jobs come and go, but ownership gives you that wealth that you can accumulate over time. So that is a central issue in the current movement around BIPOC communities, and investment from planning policy to any kind of city-state policy is really focusing on that community wealth building through those kinds of actions that, you can't just do it locally. It has to be regional and state as well, and to a certain extent, obviously federal. That, to Donald's point, I think this is a time to really work collectively to advocate for that. And there's a window of opportunity over the next couple of years to really push for that.
And might I add, Sam, that this should be an easy one, because the wealth of King County has grown so to the point, and the property values have grown so to the point that they should be able to offset some reparations for those that have suffered, and that ownership opportunity that was denied to us through redlining, through segregation, and other policies of declining and denying funding and lending.
It should be easy. It won't be easy, but it should be. I'm going to throw in a question for you, Sam, that was added to the chat. Are there ways that architects can help with the Seattle Equity Development Initiative projects?
So they are actually helping. So in the organizations that we engage with, I'll give you an example, the Ethiopian Community Center. So this is an organization that's been around for almost 30 years. A few years ago, they really wanted to expand their community center. But not only that, wanted to build affordable housing for aging seniors in the immigrant community, and mostly for the Ethiopians. So we started working with them almost 3 years ago. They don't have any development skills, capacity. So we started first funding, giving EDI, Equitable Development Initiative Fund, for capacity building, so that they can have an organizational capacity focused on getting to shovel-ready projects, and how you get there from working with architects and designers to come up with ideas in terms of what they want, so that they are competitive when the Office of Housing, for example, puts out requests for proposals for funding. Each year it puts out, anywhere from 30 to 40 to 50 to $100 million. But for them to be competitive, they needed to have the capacity. So one component of that is really thinking about what does it take to develop 60, 70 units of housing above your commercial community center. So they worked, and we funded programs so architects could come and work with the board and with the membership to really design, this design game with foam core ideas, so that they really understand what the constraints and opportunities are about the site. But most importantly, to really understand what is the within that culture, the appropriate type of housing, the appropriate configuration. And architects has been central as part of that. We were working with Africa Town in the Central District around the Midtown Plaza, for example, that was going to be funded. Before that, we worked and provided capacity building so that architects like Sarah Zodi, this Ethiopian architect, to come work with them to really think about what a local sort of African-American public plaza ought to be. So to pilot, ideas on site so that they come and have workshop. The Africa Town came up with this idea of Decipher, which is kind of, call it charrette in architecture, right? But their own version, so that we in the program funds capacity for them to really test these ideas. As Midtown Plaza, it's a development in the Central District that Africa Town will have some equity in it. The architects and designers, what they proposed initially was a typical plaza that was inward looking. Because of that engagement, they actually flipped the plan so that you have the public space, the plaza is integrated with the street out in the public space in the way that the community in that area engages with public space. It's the outdoors. So that came out of that engagement with architects and designers. There is significant role architects and designers can play, but they need to be educated as well. What, some of the issues that Jun was talking about. What is, you need to understand what is a cultural space for indigenous people look like? What is a cultural space or a public space or even a building? What does it mean for Latino communities or African American communities? I think that's where I think the tools that they learn and the stories and the histories that they need to be informed first as architects beyond sort of the traditional study that we do, and then be able to actually lend their expertise so that the community groups are well informed to be able to make their own choices and their own expression of what it is that they want, from the layout of the place to the color of the brick or the exterior fenestration that really reflects, that tells them that, hey, I belong here, or this is, it is part of me. So I think architects are a significant, important role. In fact, it should be a requirement that they should actually focus on that, because they are privileged. We are all privileged by be able to study that. And I think it's upon us to actually, and most of them do that as well. But we, at every opportunity, whether it's a private sector or the public sector, has to provide the platform in which that they are welcomed and engaged as part of that process.
Thank you, Sam. So we're at the 15-minute mark. I've got a question in the chat from Leon for June. With so much history in the Bay Area, Black Panthers, Angela Davis, and the politics and urban design policies pushing on minorities, how can we as architects unify our communities and rebuild them? June, I think you had answered that question in the chat, but I wanted to see if you could talk about that a little.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna point out how Sam referenced that Sarah Zoedi, who is African American, was brought in to talk to the African American community. Notice the cultural similarity. I think it's absolutely essential that we don't gloss that over, that the language and the familiarity is important in addressing the local community's issues. So to get back to Leon's question about the Bay Area, and I noted that I hesitate to support anything that comes with the term unifying, because it tends to gloss over the bumps in the road, but it's the bumps that give us that tell us the uniqueness about that group. And so as architects, what I'm seeing on the ground right now in Oakland is that we have bought into the institutional approach, the Spurs, the AIA, the NOMAs. We have aligned ourselves so much with the idea of institution, and then we will bring forth our privileged knowledge to communities. And as a result, we are, for all intents and purposes, useless. What I propose instead is that we need to embed ourselves within community groups. And here is why. We get to see, hear, and influence those community groups as they're thinking about their projects. As Sam explained, he had to bring in someone else to talk to that community. What we're seeing in Oakland is community groups are stepping outside of city funding or city organizations, galvanizing and organizing themselves in true Black power, true Oakland, true Black Panther history, and coming up with new cooperative, alternative, non-capitalistic approaches while still embedding capitalism in the process. And it's really funny, this unique process, but what has happened is there are coalitions that have galvanized around culture, particularly Black culture. And these groups have brought together nurses, doctors, community advocates, people who are dealing with the homeless, and they've come together around a central idea, which is they wish to improve their physical environment, and they're unapologetic about it, but they work in a very collaborative spirit. So if the medical team is going up against a policy or in support of a policy, it's not just that medical group or that Black medical group that's going in support. The entire collaborative comes behind that. And as architects, if we embed ourselves within that conversation, we get to see and hear the spatial implications of the dialogue and bring our expertise around space to that conversation and be able to inform that conversation. So we're hearing the issues directly from the community, and we're able to, and you've heard me say this term, redesign the table, because rather than being brought into after the city might have written a program, might have written an RFQ, or might have written an RFP in response to what the community said, what we are doing instead here, I'm seeing a lot more of it, we are embedding ourselves within community organizations, helping them to organize, helping to define that development strategy, and help writing the RFP or RFQ that is then issued out. So that is actually the role I'm seeing, that we have to get away from the institutional dialogues, our alignment with institutions, and start to align ourselves more aggressively and visually and visibly align ourselves with the community organizations, and then we become very useful to them. I find too much of the conversation is about what institutions could be doing for communities, and I'm saying, yes, we play a role in sorting out the legalities of our profession, but in terms of our worthiness to communities, we actually have to work in community organizations to bear fruit.
You are speaking the gospel that we need, June, and certainly that something that I talk about are investing in communities and what we can bring to not-for-profit community organizations to help them be more impactful with our heart, our training, our vision, and our experience. I am saddened to note that we only have 9 minutes left. So there are questions that I'm not going to be able to hit up, but actually we did a pretty good job. There was one on exclusionary zoning that I wanted to get to, but I with the limited time, this is what I'm going to ask. You know, and this is for each of the three of you to have a closing thought. You know, what do we need to do that we are not doing? What are we currently missing in the process? How do we move out of a space of being reactive to current circumstance and move into a space of being proactive for the future? And we've talked a little bit about that, but if each of the three of you could give some summary thoughts, I think that would be great for our audience to hear. Does anybody want to start?
June?
Oh, good.
I'm wrestling with this one. Is
Yeah.
it specifically about exclusionary zoning, or how could we be more reactive, be proactive? You know, because zoning is kind of, so here's what I would like to see. And I kind of brought this up earlier when we were prepping for this, and Sam acknowledged. I would like to see existing market forces being brought and daylight in our planning processes. And I'll just give one example, the example of where Black communities, their real estate is undervalued, severely undervalued when compared to comparable amenities in another community, comparable house size, nothing different except for the fact that one neighborhood is Black and the other one is not Black. And that the real estate value in the Black community is consistently, and this is nationwide, undervalued by the real estate agent or the real estate industry. I would like to see some of these real data, which is very much available on the web, be brought up, daylight, included in our planning processes, so that we're planning with the knowledge that we're addressing racism that's happening right now. Not historic racism, real-time racism, which we can chart right now. That's what I would like to see. I think that would start to influence how we look at zoning in a very radical way.
And if not now, then when?
Yep.
Donald?
I'll just wrap with three things that are somewhat related to what you asked, Rico. And one is in talking about the wealth of King County. We have the two richest men in the world live in Martin Luther King County, right? They're great philanthropists. I have yet to see what they do in their own backyard, and I would like to see them step up in their philanthropic role to look at some of the repair that needs to be done for the kinds of things that put them into the positions of power and money that they're in. Secondly, we need to get beyond the idea that we think there's others that are going to come and save us from public and private agencies, that we need to demand engagement. We need to start the engagement, not wait for that engagement to happen on planning and development in our community. That has happened in a few cases in the Central District already. We need to see more of that happen. We need to get engaged early and often with things like the Africatown Design Cipher. We need to let people know what we're expecting and what we are demanding before they present. We need to know more about major infrastructure projects like Seattle Schools programs for building and for Sound Transit and the Port of Seattle and others, that we can engage and involve and also make some money on those things. And third and lastly, all of the items that are necessary, like property tax justice, to build, and I'll be specific, to build Black wealth, to close that gap between Black and white wealth in home ownership, in retention of home ownership, and expansion of home ownership, is going to be one of the most traditional ways in which not only wealth is generated, but intergenerational wealth is also passed on to family members.
Thank you, Donald. Oh, go ahead, Sam.
I'll add a couple of points. So two things I think we need to seize the moment of the time that we're in. It's been a great awakening, not only because of COVID, as you know, but the Black Lives Matter movement. This is a time to double down in addressing inequities that have existed for years and years. And this is not the time to really think about going back to normal. It's really double down and focusing on all of our efforts. Private, public, really has to focus on how we address those inequities, and specifically focused on BIPOC communities, from city organizations to private sector to community groups have to really think and have a serious focus on what that means. Yes, we're 13% of the population in every city. If you don't lift everyone up, especially the Black community, you suffer as well. It's like when the Americans with Disabilities movement started, around curb cuts or access to buses. That act was focused initially, on the disability community. When that curb cuts and ramps are in place, it is helping everyone. Everyone benefits from that. It is no different in terms of addressing sort of the wealth, health disparities of the Black and Indigenous people and people of color that have been left out for quite some time. So I think one is we need to double down. The second part of it is, I think, especially specific for us, planners, architects, is to really think about the unintended consequences ahead of time and then put the guardrails in place before you do transit-oriented development. You have to think about an equitable doing that. You create the wealth first so that people who are there are going to be the beneficiaries rather than they being displaced. We're doing this in the Duwamish Valley area as a pilot. We started about 3 years ago. Major investment coming up, hundreds of millions of dollars in city investment to improve the quality of the place, the streets, the trees. We said, hey, hold on. Before we do that, and we ourselves become the agents of gentrification, we need to start thinking about what we need to do to create community wealth, ownership, and let's put that in place first before the investments come. And so we're working parallel with that, working with South Park community to figure out what kind of ownership or wealth they can have so that they are the beneficiaries and that they're not displaced. So I think putting the guardrails ahead of time before we put our policies in place.
Did we lose Rico?
Mariana, are you going to close or?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Well, unfortunately, it looks like Rico dropped the call. So I just want to, in closing, I just want to thank everybody for attendance and especially thank our panelists for graciously giving us their time of the day on the weekend and sharing their experiences and sharing their thoughts with us. I want to thank our attendees as well for being here and listening and asking good questions. We will follow up with a list of attendees and provide resources that were provided in chat as well, just for your convenience. And I also want to leave the opportunity for Leon or Whitney to say something in closing.
Gotcha. Yeah. So it was a great discussion. I personally want to thank the panelists for joining us on this Saturday. Hopefully everybody's able to get outside on this beautiful day. But thanks for everybody for coming to this talk. Hopefully you were able to glean some great information. I know it's like basically trying to drink water from a fire hose with all this information, but hopefully something lands and that we're able to make a change moving forward.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that concludes our panel discussion today. Everybody have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
I may add just one quick thing. I am going to distribute a recording of this program to everyone, just to be clear. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Thank you guys so much.
Oh, there's Rico.